everyone, welcome back to the BookBucks channel. I'm Bakhtawer and I talk about books. I've been gone a while. I know I keep saying that in the beginning of every video, but what can I say? You know, life sort of, it gets in the way. It gets in the way of creative content. So today I'm going to be doing a sort of wrap up of these two books that I read in the last week or so. One is called The Spy and the Traitor by Ben McIntyre, and A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived by Adam Rutherford. And I've been reading quite a lot of nonfiction recently, so I thought that I could maybe go through it in videos like this, 2 to 3 books at a time, because often it doesn't make sense to make a whole video about just one book, especially if it's, nonfiction and doesn't require that level of depth and analysis. So first up, The Spy and the Traitor. It's written by Ben McIntyre, who is a British author, and as it says on the cover, the greatest espionage story of the Cold War. So this is basically, now I've had this book for quite a while, I think more than a year. My mother actually read it before me, and I didn't get around to it. I kept buying other books and everything, so I finally read it, and I really liked it. It's a story of the Soviet KGB spy, ex-spy, Oleg Gordievsky. I don't know why I keep looking at the cover. And I'm sorry about my voice. I don't know what's happening. This reminds me of that scene from Little Mermaid. My voice? Anyway, so I don't know what's wrong with my voice. So yeah, it's about the ex-KGB spy Oleg Gordievsky. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing this correctly for obvious reasons. So he was basically a double spy for KGB, but also for MI6. And he is thought to have, leaked some of the greatest secrets that helped, Britain sort of, come out on the right side of the Cold War. And he was apparently indispensable to Margaret Thatcher, no less, the Iron Lady, or was she called something else? So he escaped detention for, I think, more than 10 years. But then eventually they became suspicious, KGB became suspicious about him. And they called him back to Moscow, where they, tried to interrogate him and everything, but MI6 already had an escape plan set up 10 years from 10 years before. They'd planned out everything, what if he gets trapped? What if he's recalled? How do we get him out? So the operation was called Pimlico. It was Pimlico, I think. And they did manage to pull Operation Pimlico off, and they got him back to Britain, and he lives there to this day, apparently. So it starts, as you can imagine, from the beginning. Oleg was this, born into this, what you might call a KGB family. His brother was in the KGB, his father was in the KGB. I think other family members had also. So it was very much like a family tradition. There was, that kind of, almost patriotism that seems to have been connected. But of course, Oleg was different, as you can imagine. He had a more inquisitive nature. He was, sort of more. He was always trying to read literature that was banned in the Soviet Union at the time. Things like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, and other novels and such. In fact, there's this scene in this book in which the KGB, they sort of break into his apartment when he's not there, and they find like this whole box of banned literature under his bed. It's really funny. So yeah, eventually, he joins the KGB and everything, and he has his first foreign posting, which is to Denmark, I believe. And there, for the first time, he's kind of almost exposed to the Western way of life. He finds it to be this sharp contrast between how life is very controlled and censored back home, and he really takes to it immediately. And it's not just, sort of this preferential kind of attachment that he has to it. It also seems to happen on a spiritual level. He feels alive for the first time in his life, in contrast with, as the author calls it, the cultural wasteland of the Soviet Union. Not that I know how true that is, because the Soviet Union in the 20th century alone produced a wealth of scores of world-class writers and playwrights and everything, so I don't know how much of that is true. However, I think he means it. To be fair, I think he probably means it in the sense that everything was sort of state-controlled and censored. I think even the music you could listen to had to be cleared by the state, and I think there were like allowed records that you could listen to and allowed literature and everything. So yeah, he becomes increasingly alienated. He almost has some kind of silent nervous breakdown, because apparently you can't even have one of those out in the open, especially when he was working for an organization like that. So he has like this existential crisis. He starts questioning everything he's ever believed in, and he becomes increasingly alienated from his own country and culture. and he's married to a woman who also works for the KGB, and she's like what you would call a standard sort of KGB woman. She's kind of stern and doesn't show her emotions, and he becomes alienated from her as well. He starts an affair with another woman. I think her name was Laura or something, unless I'm wrong. I mean, there's so many names in this book, you sometimes kind of mix them. So yeah, the new existence, intellectually stimulating. There's libraries and bookshops everywhere. There's music. There's, I don't know, parties. He becomes really enamored with it, and that's when the sort of the seed of doubt enters his mind, so to speak. And he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. But you can't just leave. So he's like, what if I start spying for one of the people that are on the opposite side of all of this, and I sort of leak information, because he had a position, obviously a very high up position. And he's like, what if I leak information to to Britain or to the US? And he starts thinking about all of this, and then he gives a signal to MI6. It's sort of not described exactly how. It's apparently these organizations have people that are entirely dedicated to finding sort of people who might be willing to kind of turn over to the other side, so to speak. So they have apparently people dedicated to just that task. So then he starts working for MI6. There's a ton of spy terminology in this, and it's very interesting, how what his earlier training was, and then how he sort of gets the documents out, lots of gadgets and everything. But of course you have to bear in mind this is more like the 80s and 90s, so it's not like the gadgets or the internet of today, but it's still pretty badass. So a great portion of the book is dedicated to Operation Pimlico. I mean, apparently when the KGB, they first sort of recall him back to Moscow, they're not even sure of what he's done. I mean, he was that good at covering up his tracks that they weren't entirely sure. They were just suspicious. So, he hadn't, but obviously Britain put forward the operation anyway to get him out. And he left his wife and children behind, and it took about 6 years to get them to Britain, and then he ended up having a divorce and such. But a great portion of the book is dedicated to that operation of exfiltration, as it is called. And it's really funny. They're being chased half the time by, KGB cars, and they have to build up all of these continuous elaborate ruses to sort of move from one village to the other till they get to the Finnish border. And then it's a whole thing. It's like 3 borders they have to cross. And then one of the agents has a newborn baby, and she continually has to change his diapers, I think his or her diapers. And in fact, they use the diapers as a sort of to confuse, one of those, what are they called? Those German shepherds that are trained sniffer dogs. It's amazing. It's really exciting. It's really edge of your seat sort of excitement, pure kind of thriller stuff. So it's written very well in that context. And it's written like a non-fiction thriller, but there is a great deal of, not a great deal, but a considerable deal, I would say. A bit of, sensationalism, a bit of bias. Obviously the writer's British, so he's sort of put forward this very, good against evil, Hades against the Olympians, very black and white kind of narrative. He's not left a great deal of space for, the gray area that really comes with international politics and international relations. And so he's keen to sort of demonize one side and just make the other side out to be this pillar of light, which of course I don't know if you're supposed to be that subjective if it's nonfiction, but it seems to work. I think he's written a ton of books like this. I think they're mostly on spies and everything, so it seems to be something he's deeply passionate about. And for the most part, dates and everything seems historically accurate, but more so than anything else, I think take its accuracy, especially of more subjective details and everything, with a bit of salt, I suppose, with a dash of salt. But other than that, it was really enjoyable, really eye-opening, especially if you're like a student of, international relations or something like that. I think you'll find this very interesting because there's a ton of the Cold War in there as well. So yeah, coming to the second book, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived by Adam Rutherford. Now this was such a relief, this book, and I'm going to explain why. Recently I've been reading all manner of pseudo-research nonsense, mostly those horrible Ryan Holiday books. I read a couple. And everything that I seem to be reading nowadays, there were like 5-6 books sort of close together, and they all seemed like, it's the writer sort of spinning things his direction, and there's not enough citations. You don't know how true something is. And I was so sick of that this book was, I have to say, a very, very welcome relief. It's very well researched. It's got a ton of information, and it's sort of presented very nicely also. So this book is, as you can see, the stories in our genetics. It's all about DNA, it's all about genes. And the best thing about it is that it offers such an in-depth analysis, but it's brilliant for people who don't have any sort of knowledge about genetics. People that are complete beginners like myself. So it starts with the out of Africa hypothesis, which says that Homo sapiens, they sort of came about 200,000 years ago. There's something in my eyeball. Anyway, then everybody originated in Africa, and then they sort of traveled out of Africa to the far reaches of the globe. People that moved towards the west, towards Europe, they developed paler skin, because obviously there was less sun, so there was less evolutionary need for melanin. And then everybody knows Homo sapiens, all the humans that live today are considered Homo sapiens, which were the most cognitively advanced of all the earlier hunter-gatherer and nomadic humans, such as Neanderthals, and I think they're called Denisovians or something. Very complicated pronouncing all of this. So yeah, he puts forward this further theory that apparently all the other types of human beings were alive, and that they sort of, had unions with Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens, of course, have the DNA of all the earlier sort of hunter-gatherer humans. So from a DNA perspective, one can argue that those humans never fully went extinct, as is commonly believed, because everybody has some level of, Neanderthal or other type of earlier human DNA. There's a wealth of examples in this book, for Indonesia, China, you name it. This was one particular one that I liked. I think there's a cave in Indonesia in which they found remains that they named hobbits, because all of those earlier humans, they were, I don't know, really old, and they were all very, very small in size, and they were so cute. Why is that cute? But they were very cute, and they named them hobbits. And there's this other, he says that science now has advanced to the point that it can extract DNA, like live DNA, from bone marrow of earlier humans, like humans that have been dead for 30, 40,000 years, in some cases millions of years. So science has gotten to that point. But of course, it's not a complete set of DNA, it's like a partial. And but it's still amazing. I think they extracted DNA from the tip of a finger of a human being that had existed hundreds of thousands of years ago in a cave in Siberia. And they only had the tip of the small finger. They just had that, and they were able to extract DNA from it. That is amazing. And then, I particularly like the example where he talks about Christopher Lee, Christopher Lee, who was Saruman in Lord of the Rings and Count Dooku in Star Wars. So it's a popularly held belief. I don't know if Christopher Lee himself said this or not, but it's a popularly held belief that Christopher Lee had sort of descended from, Charlemagne, the Roman emperor, who was one of the most important Europeans to ever have lived. And apparently his mother, who was a countess in Italy, had direct familial links with that emperor. And that's probably true, but then Adam Rutherford brings forward this, this sort of proposition, which I thought was very insightful. He says that, how people use this concept of lineage to create a narrative, to create a story which is then useful in some way. When you see all of those really odd television programs, they're like, oh, we're going to go into this tomb and we're going to figure this out, and now we've tested the DNA. You don't know whether they've tested it or not, and then it's conclusively led to, everybody likes those very, very neat, put together stories, all of them with a bow on top, and you don't know the science behind it, but they're kind of tailored for a public that has no knowledge of genetic science. So, in the case of Christopher Lee, for example, you sort of have it in your mind, oh, the man has descended from kings. That's why, he's got the operatic sort of voice, and he's got the deep, the deep voice, like I said, and the personality and the jaw and the nose and the height, and because it fits into that narrative that he is this majestic sort of figure. Which of course he was, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of Christopher Lee, I love him. And then he goes on to say, how when serial killers are profiled, everybody, until a few decades ago, everybody thought that, if somebody's a serial killer, they must have some kind of really serious physical defect in their brains to make them, violently torture and kill a lot of people. But then they studied quite a few serial killer brains, and they found, it's the Occam razor principle, people. The simplest solution is usually the correct one. Their brains were just like regular human brains. They could have been you, me, or anybody else. So it's a choice. DNA is not destiny, is what the writer puts forward. Whatever people choose to do, it's a choice. You can't say that, oh, that person had some kind of, some physical defect, some dormant gene which made them act this certain way. So there's no link like that. And then, I think a couple of years ago, I'd started seeing on YouTube, you know how everybody was putting up these videos. Oh, I've sent my DNA to this company and they've told me, oh, I descended from Vikings or whoever else. And they give you this whole file and it's great. And you just, I think, give them you do like a swab sort of test. So you give them like a blob of your saliva and they tell you, what diseases you have. In fact, they don't even tell you about the diseases. They just tell you, it's kind of like an anonymous profile. So they tell you, oh, what color are your eyes and nonsense like that, which he said that it's, take that genetic sequencing industry with a bit of salt, because he's like, they, most of the time they tell you stuff that you already know. And DNA is not like that. It's not like a timeline or a chart of how your life's going to go and what your abilities are. There are other ways of finding all of that information, and this is not possibly the best way. And then he talks about the Human Genome Project, which was, I think, in the 90s, this huge international research project in which geneticists from all over the world, contributed, and they were trying to figure out the exact genetic structure of human beings. In the end, they found that human beings only have 20,000 genes in total, which is actually a very, very small amount, because I think he said, the author said that some plants even have more genes than that. So, what I like particularly about Adam Rutherford's style is that he's not trying to feed you information or talk at you, oh, I'm this big geneticist, I'm just going to tell you stuff and you're ignorant. He leaves the room open for doubt. He poses questions. He does not believe in providing definite answers because, findings are always changing. Theories are always being replaced by other theories. He believes that the scientific process is one of continuous self-questioning, And then there was a considerable discussion of the eugenics theory of 1883, which was put forward by Francis Galton. Francis Galton was sort of like a jack of all trades. He invented things. He made findings in geography, sociology, mathematics, astronomy even. I mean, I think he had contributions in a number of fields. And then somewhere along the way, and obviously biology, and then somewhere along the way, he became obsessed with this idea that the human race, you could study the human race and you could find traits which he thought are desirable traits. And through, certain processes, the ones that are followed with horses and dogs and such, you could craft a better race, a human race that is free of disease and other what he considered defects. Needless to say, he was wrong. Well, of course, thinking like this, thinking that some traits are superior and some races are superior and some aren't, this is considered completely mad and racist and unethical and downright evil in today's time, and rightly so. Unfortunately, at the time, these dangerous ideas were taking root in a lot of countries. They'd already started being implemented. In the US, they had started doing forcible sterilization of people who they thought were, not up to the mark, as they thought. People that had mental problems or people that had certain illnesses, chronic illnesses. And then in Germany, that would later become Nazi Germany, but it wasn't at the time. They had started kind of, again, sterilizing people like this, but they also had, can you believe, most of their hospitals had crematoriums attached to them. So they were actually, and then they would write sort of false letters to the family members and say, oh, the child or the adult, he died of malaria or hepatitis or something else. But in fact, they were killing all of those people because they had chronic illnesses or they were going to die anyway. So it was forcible and euthanasia without consent. They hadn't taken permission from anyone. They were just, oh, we're just going to mercy kill all of these people. And and people that were considered, of low cognitive intelligence, people that had various illnesses, retardation, stuff like that, they were just cremating them and lying about it. And it's weird when you see how that was happening. So that was the beginning of something that would become far, far more evil and nefarious later down the road. So, when you read history, I have 2 degrees in political science. History has always been very, of particular interest to me. When you read of any of the great acts of evil committed, you always find that they began with small acts, acts that probably went unnoticed, weren't that significant, and then it kind of kept growing and growing and increasing in scale. So by the time, it's time to massacre a ton of people, or do something else, or initiate a genocide, it seems to no longer be surprising to the people that are doing it, because they've been conditioned over a period of time to so when they finally reach that, it's like they've already done so much, or smaller things, and they've been conditioned that it's no longer surprising or unusual to them, and that makes it easier for them to commit those crimes. I'm reminded of, did anyone else read that? I bet everybody did. That fable that we used to read as children, of that frog who's put in a saucepan on a low boil, so like just lukewarm water, and he's having a nice time, but before he knows it, he's been cooked. But if you put a frog directly in a hot thing of water, he will jump right out, because it'll be a shock to his system. But when you put him on a slow boil, he doesn't notice it, and he dies, and he gets cooked in the process. So it's kind of like that. When something happens slowly over a period of time, you don't notice that it's happening. You don't notice its significance. So yeah, when you do small acts of kindness in your daily life, know that they are worth it. Don't question anything good that you do. Oh, if I donate a bit of money, or if I volunteer one day a week somewhere, or even once in a while, or whatever, it doesn't matter. But it matters to somebody. Every act of kindness matters, just like every act of evil matters. So everything matters in the world, everything that you do. So never think that something is too small and not worthy of notice, because it is. It's the small things that keep the evil at bay, as Gandalf would say in The Lord of the Rings. And on that note, I'm going to sign out. Thank you so much for joining me. Make sure that you're subscribing so that you don't miss any of my future videos. Best wishes.